Hello, we're back to Najdorf games, and this time we're gonna see another great game of Fischer played against Keres. So here we are at the starting position of Najdorf, and Keres chose bishop g5, e6. Well, in the videos I recommended knight bd7, f4 and queen c7, with the point that we delay the e-pawn movement so that in some positions e5 is better, or we develop with g6. But there I also mentioned the line after e6, f4, bishop e7, queen f3, and queen c7 was played in the game, but there was a very interesting story about h6. This is exactly the move I mentioned in the videos. Bishop h4, g5, f takes g5, knight fd7, and knight e6. F takes e6, queen h5, king f8, and bishop b5, with a lot of complications, but afterwards Fischer found a move, rook h7, which equalizes. But here actually there is a very famous Argentine strategy, because in the 14th round of the international tournament in Gothenburg, it was tried simultaneously this exact position in 3 games between Soviets and Argentinian grandmasters, and in all 3 games Soviet players won. Keres won against Najdorf, Galler won against Pano, and Spassky won against Pilnik. But after rook h7, queen g6, rook f7, queen h6, king g8, queen g6, rook g7, queen takes on e6, king h8, bishop d7, knight d7, castle, 95, it is Fischer gained a draw here. So let's go back to the game. Queen f3, queen c7 was played in this game, castle, knight bd7, and here Keres played bishop e2, novelty for that time, because queen g3 was played, dull played against Fischer, bishop d3 was played, and the main line of course was g4, Gligorich's favorite line, with b5, bishop f6, knight f6, g5, knight goes back to d7, a3, and rook b8, with the idea of b4 and counterattack on queen side. So bishop e2, b5, bishop f6, knight f6, and here we are, a surprise with e5. On a3 there is the same idea, with rook b8 followed by b4, and black has a counterplay. So e5, bishop b7, what else? E takes f6, Keres decided to sacrifice the queen, bishop f3, and here is a very critical point. Black has 2 pieces attacked, rook on a8 and the bishop on e7, so now it's the time for a decision which piece to move here, bishop or the rook. Rook c8 here is interesting, but worse than the move which was played in the game. After f takes e7, b4 is necessary, because after queen e7, knight f5 has terrible threats. ef5 is not possible because of rook h e1, and otherwise the d6 pawn is hanging and the queen on e7 is hanging at the same time. So b4, knight c2 and g6. G6 idea is to control the f5 square and the f4 pawn movement, and well, it's very unclear position. But Fischer played an amazing move here, leaving the rook on a8 and foreseeing the fact that this bishop on a8 will be in trouble. So after bishop f6, bishop a8 and d5, shutting the bishop on a8 and threatening castle. So bishop d5 was played in the game. Actually, maybe more precise was to play bishop d4 first, rook d4 and d5. I say this because on d5, Keres had some chances with bishop c6, king f8 and knight ce2. Now the knight protects another knight, and in case of bishop d4, knight d4, queen takes on f4, king b1, queen d6, rook goes to f-file, open file, king e7, rook de1 with the idea of knight f5. So queen c5, c3 and b4 with very complicated position. But also on king f8, knight ce2, g6 is possible with the idea of king g7 and rook c8 to have a sharp play and as many pieces as possible. But bishop d5 was played in the game and bishop d4. This clarifies the position because after queen f4, king b1 and e d5, actually bishop d4 here is a mistake because of bishop c6, king e7 and knight e2. Double attack. So e d5, knight d5, queen g4, rook h8, king f8, and white has a good compensation. So bishop d4, rook d4, e d5, knight d5 and queen c5. So Fischer has an extra queen. Of course, white has a good compensation, but still queen is a queen. Rook e1, king f8 and c3. White protects the rook on d4, and this is the critical moment in the game. Of course, black's position is no worse, and white is trying to have some compensation with the files. And so the king on f8 is a bit not on best place, and the main problem of black is the rook on h8, which is still not developed and is not in the game. And now, as we mentioned that the rook on h8 is not developed, there is an obvious move, h5. With the idea of rook h6 and to be in the game, rook c6 or rook d6, just to have the rook in the game. Keres played f5, trying to prevent the coordination of black pieces, rook h6 and f6. So, throwing away a pawn into attempt to keep the black rook shut on h6. There was interesting rook e d1, but then rook d6. Actually, on any move like rook e5, rook d6, rook de4, with the idea of mate, king g8, and king has a safe square on h7. So f6, gf6, and knight f4. Instead of knight f4, knight e3 was better, because after rook g6, rook d8, king g7, there is rook d5, queen b6, and rook takes on h5, rook g5, and rook h4. Well, there are some threats. So after, for example, rook h4, after rook h4, white has good compensation. For example, rook e5, there is king d2. Of course, black has not worse position and is still playing for win, but this variation is better than the moves that was played in the game. So knight f4, h4, rook d8. According to Fischer, rook e2 should have been played, but Keres chose rook d8, king g7, and rook e8. This is overestimating white's chances, because after queen g1, king d2, queen f2, knight has to go back to e2, and now the rook is free to move, and rook g6. Rook attacks the g2 pawn, and it is in the game. g3 was played in the game. Rook g8 doesn't give anything. After king h6, rook h8, just king g5, and white gets nowhere. So g3, f5. A very good move with the threat of queen h2. Rook g8, king f6. Rook d6 here after king e7, rook g6, f takes g6, rook g6. There is a great move h3 with the idea of queen h2, and black has a passed pawn. Rook g6, f takes g6, g takes h4. And here it is very pity that Fischer took the wrong pawn. After having an enormous advantage, Fischer took the pawn on h2. Rook d4. Instead of queen h2, there was queen h4, better move, and leaving this pawn on h2 and not the one on h4. So rook d6, king f7, h3 is just followed by queen h6, first check, and then take the pawn on h3. Well, not immediately queen h4, just because of rook g6. And if queen h6, king c2, queen h3, and now rook g6, then there is a move queen h2, pinning the knight on e2 and threatening, and also the rook on g6 is hanging. So Queen h2 was played in the game, which gave Keres big chances for a draw, but after rook d4, good move protecting the h4 pawn, Queen h1 with the idea of Queen b1, King c2, covering the b1 square, King e5 and a4. Keres tries to make the b5 pawn very weak, so after Queen f1, Knight c1, well, here actually King d2 was bad because of Queen a1, King c2 and b takes a4, and if now Knight c1, then there is an a3, b takes a3 doesn't make any sense due to Queen a3 and Queen is free, so Knight d3, King f6, b takes a3, Queen a3, and this pawn cannot be stopped. So Knight c1, Queen g2, and now Keres went on a wrong square. He played King b3, but instead he had a very good chance of fortress with King d1. B takes a4, Knight d3 first, check, King f6, Rook takes a4, a5 and Rook d4. And we see that the Rook is perfect on 4th rank, and it's very, very difficult for Black to make any progress. King b3 was played in the game, b takes a4 and King a3. If now Rook a4, then the drawback of King b3 is the d2 square. Queen d2, Knight a2 and just f4. And now this pawn is unstoppable. Rook a3, King a3, Queen c2, Knight d3, King f6, Knight c5, controlling the b3 square not to be mated, Queen c1. Rook a4 was played in the game. Instead, Knight a4, then there is f4. Queen c1 actually is a very strong move supporting the f4 square, so that Black has a chance to advance the pawn. So after Knight a4 there is f4, Knight c5, f3, and on check King just goes to e7, Knight f2 does not help, Queen f1, Knight d1 and Queen e2. Now White does not have f2 square, so after, for example, King a2, King goes to g7, to h6, and after that there is a5, King a4, Queen e6, White takes on a5, check, King b4, and f2. And if Knight f2, Queen b2, Black wins the piece. So Rook a4 was played in the game, Queen e3, and Keres took on a6. But after this, f4 and the f-pawn is really unstoppable. Rook d4, King f5, King supports the pawn, and Knight b4. I think actually that Keres missed this reply, that the pawn can advance and it is supported with the king. So after Knight b4, Queen e7, pinning the knight on b4, King b3, Queen takes h4, Knight d3 and g5, c4, Queen g3, c5, f3. The queen is very good also, controlling the c7 square. So after king c4, f2, knight f2, queen f2, c6, queen takes b2, and knight d5, king d5 was played in the game, and after g4, rook c4, Fischer mated Keres in a very nice way in the center of the board with queen e5. I hope you enjoyed the game and learned a lot from this game. Thank you for watching. See you soon.